flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Roll call, please, Ms. Clerk.
Councilmember Jordan?
Here.
Councilmember Alejandro Gutierrez?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon?
Here.
Councilmember Friedman?
Here.
Councilmember Harmon is not present today. Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez?
Present.
And Mayor Murillo?
Here. Thank you so much, Ms. Gorman. We will go to open public comment. Today, our meeting is a budget hearing, but we will take a public comment on items that are not on our official agenda. Ms. Clerk, is there anyone waiting in line for that?
Madam Mayor, we have one speaker who has called in, Mr. Michael Nelson. Mr. Nelson, if you would like to speak in general public comment, please raise your hand now. Otherwise, we will call on you when we get to the substantive item. And Madam Mayor, he's not indicating that he's raising his hand. No, so no general public comment.
We'll close that public comment period and we'll go to item number 1. Ms. Clerk, please read the item into the record.
Item 1, fiscal year 2021 recommended operating and capital budget.
Very good. Mr. Casey, we have a budget hearing on what topics today?
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. So this is your second budget hearing as we work through the month of May, going through the departments. Today, we will have the airport department lead off, followed by the waterfront department, and then we'll wrap up today with a general fund and Measure C capital program, the adjustments that we're looking there. Just as you enter into airport and waterfront, they are 2 of our enterprise funds. And so they are required to balance their expenditures to their revenues within that fund without any general fund support. So just keep that in mind as you go through those departments. But I'm ready at this point to turn it over to the airport department.
Is it Mr. Thompson?
Yes, ma'am.
Welcome, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and council members. We're here today to present the FY21 Airport Enterprise Fund operating and capital budgets. As you might expect, this year's budget comes with great challenges, but I also believe there are potential opportunities ahead for us as well. Pre-COVID-19, Santa Barbara Airport was the fastest growing airport in Southern California. In 2 months preceding the pandemic, we were up 40% and 44% year over year, respectively. I share that because what it shows is that we have a good product, that being the beauty of Santa Barbara. We believe our air service will return. The only question is how slow or fast the recovery will be. That will be determined by 2 factors, the economy and passenger confidence in flying. The airport and airline industries are working in conjunction with the federal government on measures that will ensure passengers are safe when flying. That is the highest priority. But not understanding how those factors will evolve brings some uncertainty that we have to plan for. We are monitoring our industry closely and have identified the necessary triggers that will drive our spending and our budget this year. Specifically, we will monitor economic conditions, both locally and on a national level, to look for signs of improvement and growth. We will also look at airline service levels, paying attention to expansion of service or contraction. We will also look at advanced bookings that the airlines receive that are an indicator of growth as well. And we will look at passenger boardings here in Santa Barbara, paying close attention to our business and our leisure segments and looking for growth in those areas. And then finally, we're going to be looking at industry growth overall. With this pandemic, airports around the world saw an immediate 96% decline in passengers traveling. We have now begun to see some improvement as people are now beginning to fly. We will continue to monitor this recovery rate and compare our rate of recovery to how other airports are doing across the country as well. These are the things that we will need to look at in managing our budget this year. Any projections we might attempt to make even today would quite simply prove not accurate or helpful. So we will monitor these triggers very closely and make adjustments in real time. Before we get into the details of our budget, I'd like to highlight some of the details in the development of this budget. First of all, the same cautionary approach that the general fund departments are going through with the development of this year's budget, the enterprise funds are going through a similar exercise. The airport is only different in the source and the use of its revenues and the regulatory nature of some of our expenses. The proposed budget before you today was essentially developed pre-COVID-19. It was built with sound projections, and we were very optimistic about growth. However, COVID-19 is a game changer and will require us to make some significant adjustments to this FY21 budget if the pandemic goes on for a sustained period of time and depending on how slow the economic recovery turns out to be. And that's that uncertainty that I've shared with you. However, with your approval, the airport has already accepted the award of nearly $10 million in 2019 CARES Act for airport funds to support us through the financial crisis caused by COVID-19. Those funds will continue to help shore us up in this new budget. Specifically, in our FY21 budget planning, CARES Act funds will ensure that whatever our revenue shortfalls ultimately turn out to be, that debt service payments are covered. That removes tremendous pressure and uncertainty. In addition, CARES Act funds have been earmarked to support salaries for the first 6 months of this budget. Again, the hope is that this critical CARES Act funds will provide a necessary bridge for us to begin to recover revenues due to the COVID pandemic. Our current approach does not anticipate the need to use airport reserves. However, that does assume some level of recovery in the coming months. So our approach is to continue to monitor those triggers I mentioned earlier, and we will make needed adjustments throughout the year to ensure that we are fiscally responsible. And finally, the airport is required to meet with the airlines that serve Santa Barbara, who contribute to a majority of our budget, and they are in agreement with the rates and charges and budget we are presenting to you today. They understand the challenges of this budget, and discussions are ongoing with them as they deal with their own financial crisis and recovery. And with that, I will hand it over to Deanna Zachrison, Manager of Business Development, to go over the details of our budget.
All right. Good afternoon, Mayor Murillo, council members. Thank you very much for your time this afternoon. The information that we'll present today will be presented in a similar fashion as you've seen for some of the other city departments last week. We'll give you a very brief summary of who we are and what we do at Santa Barbara Airport, followed by an overview of our budget as it was finalized just a couple of short months ago, a period of time that still feels like an eternity for us. And then we'll provide you with a summary of what has changed and what continues to change as we try to navigate this new environment that we're in, including some of the planned changes on the revenue and expenditure side to adjust to this environment. And finally, despite the current challenges that we have, we'd like to touch on some of the achievements of the fiscal year that we are now ending. that are going to be part of laying the foundation for our recovery. So next slide. All right, and next slide. All right, Santa Barbara Airport is the largest commercial airport between Los Angeles and San Jose, and yet we are still a small airport. We work to differentiate ourselves from our primary competition, which is, of course, the airports to the south of us, by way of a unique travel experience that we can offer. We are the Depart Differently airport. We're convenient, efficient, stress-free. And these are attributes that should be even more important as air travel recovers from COVID-19. We offer service on industry-leading carriers to major destinations and beyond. And we had a record year in calendar year 2019 with nearly 1 million passengers and more than 100,000 takeoffs and landings. But there's many sides to Santa Barbara Airport, and we'd also like to give a nod to one of them that's perhaps a little less recognized, but extremely important for our financial stability. And that is our robust portfolio of commercial industrial properties that surround the airport. Next slide. All right, we are a little more than 60 employees in the airport department. And here you can see our key roles. The administration, airport administration, is sort of the nave of the organization, coordinating all of the various parts and functions. Airport operations obviously manages the operations of the airport safely, efficiently, and in compliance with many, many federal requirements. Airport facilities maintains, repairs, improves the vast array of airport facility assets that we have. And then business development works to fulfill our mandate by the federal government to be a self-sustaining revenue enterprise by managing our properties and pursuing new business opportunities. And lastly, there's a number of support functions that are housed with us, such as firefighting and rescue, airport planning, engineering, and project management services. Next slide. As you're aware, we are an enterprise fund, which is somewhat unique for the city, but it is actually part of what is very typical for an airport operation anywhere. We receive our certificate to operate as a commercial airport from the Federal Aviation Administration, and we're part of a national air transportation system. We operate 24/7, and we must remain open to serve our community. We receive no local or state tax dollars to operate, and with the exception of our federal grant funding, we must generate our own revenues from our operations. And then those revenues are in turn funneled back into the operation of the airport. So it's a bit of a closed loop system for our revenues. And while we're very much a part of Santa Barbara Airport, we're very much a municipal airport, we're also heavily regulated by the Federal Transportation and Security Agencies and the State Department of Transportation. So next slide. As you know, we operate under a fund-based accounting system, and it's a bit important to know a little bit about what these key funds include. Our operating fund is obviously our largest and most important fund. The Airport Development Fund is designated for real estate development, and right now specifically it collects revenues from our relatively recent commercial industrial development at 6100 Hollister Avenue. And it also pays against a debt that we have to the City General Fund for that development. The Airport T-Hangar Fund collects revenues from our development of 24 smaller airplane hangars on the field, and the T refers to the shape of those hangars. And it also pays the debt service on a state loan that we have for that development. And then we have two types of capital funds. As we'll touch on a little bit later, the vast majority of our capital projects are funded by grants from the FAA, and we have an annual grant entitlement of around $3 million for that fund. But there's other capital projects that aren't eligible for FAA grant funding, and we amass revenue in those in the non-FAA grant fund for those projects. And then finally, we have a passenger facility charge fund, or PFC fund, we call it. Every traveler pays a passenger facility charge as part of purchasing an airline ticket, and a portion of that charge goes to the originating airport, and we use that funding to partially support the debt service on the airline terminal. Next slide. Department staffing. As I mentioned earlier, we're a little more than 60 employees at the airport, but that does not include 9 FTEs from City Fire and 2 FTEs from Public Works that provide engineering and project support. We are very lean for an airport of our size, and that's really a reflection of that. We're very judicious with adding new staff, but nonetheless, we have proposed the addition of 2 FTEs in the FY21 budget. And one of those positions would be in the operations department as an operations specialist who would be actively working the airfield to increase safety and security, as well as compliance amongst the many users of our airfield property. And we believe that this is really a critical reinforcement based on the amount of compliance issues that we deal with on an ongoing basis. The other position is in response to a new responsibility that the airport assumed last year for the operation of our air terminal gates. We now have the ability to place any airline and any aircraft type at any one of our 5 boarding gates. But we're also now responsible for the new terminal systems that manage that. And so we need to designate a senior electronics technician to that system and other systems that are critical for the safe and timely operation of our flights. Next slide. So now we're going to transition to discussing our budget proposal. So we're presenting today a total proposed budget of $28.7 million for FY21. And this is an illustration of our total revenue streams, which you can see the vast majority of our revenues are being generated from our own operations. Nearly 60% of our operational revenues are generated by commercial aviation, and that's indirectly and directly. The next slide will just illustrate further where these revenues are coming from. And you can see that terminal properties, and that's mostly leased by commercial airlines, and commercial aviation make up the lion's share. And then within commercial aviation, you not only have the direct revenues from airlines, but also the indirect revenues that come from people coming and going, parking their car or renting a car or buying a cup of coffee, that kind of thing. And then in the non-commercial aviation revenues, we have our 2 fixed base operators that are largely responsible for our private and corporate aviation, and also to a lesser degree, recreational aviation. So then finally, you can see just how important then our commercial and industrial properties are for the total revenue picture. Next slide. So now looking at how we use these revenues, this is an illustration of how our expenses are allocated, and airport administration includes some pretty significant things, such as our department-wide allocations to other city departments, as well as our debt service. Otherwise, our main expenditures are for operations and security and maintenance of our airfield and our building facilities. Next slide. So before we delve into the specifics of our proposed revenues and expenditures, I just want to reiterate that, as Henry mentioned, this budget proposal reflects, for the most part, the world as we viewed it at the end of February. And our worldview has certainly changed since then, but we've yet been able to form another sense of, with any degree of certainty, a new view of what the world is going to look like in the coming year. So there is some uncertainty, obviously, going into the next year. However, there is, in one respect, an element of uncertainty that Director Thompson also touched on, which is that's been mitigated for us in terms of the uncertainty, and that is the CARES Act, which we'll be talking quite a bit about. But it also means that the status quo budget is not quite status quo for us in the coming year, and we'll talk more about that. So next slide. So as Director Thompson mentioned, there is the CARES Act, and there's the fact that the airport will be a benefactor of this federal legislation. Just for context, today's crisis is not the first crisis that aviation has faced, even though it is a significant one. In the last 20 years, airlines and airports have been crippled by significant events like this. But what is different this time is that Congress recognized that airports, and not just airlines, were in need of critical support to fulfill our mission in this challenging time. So at the end of March, Congress allocated nearly $10 billion to airports with a very specific intent. Congress wanted to make sure that no airport would default on its mortgage, on its facilities, its debt, and that employees would be kept in place to assure the integrity of operations, despite the losses we would experience in revenues. So next slide, we touch on revenues for our operating fund. And I'd first like to point out that the revised year-end 2020 budget showing here is about 20 million. It's yet to be updated based on our Q3 results and our own recent year-end projections. So we do believe that we will have a revenue shortfall for FY 2020 of about 2.7 million because of what obviously looks like is going to be a pretty abysmal fourth quarter. However, it would likely be much worse without the infusion of funding that we're receiving from the CARES Act, which in total will be about 9.6 million. The proposed revenues, as you can see here for the operating fund, are 25.1 million. And obviously the vulnerability that we have with regard to those revenues is chiefly within the direct and indirect revenues that come from commercial aviation. So next slide. The remainder of our funds, which are grant and fee funds, are shown here. It's worth noting that the passenger facility charge line item that you see here at 2.4 million is going to be impacted as compared to budget, because with fewer passengers, we will collect less of these fees. But again, these fees would go to our debt service, which is going to be shored up by the CARES Act funding. Also, you see here for our FAA capital grants, we typically do not budget here for a number of reasons how the grant funding works. It's not typically awarded until after the budget is approved and we know then what our grant match is going to be. And we'll touch a little bit more on that. But we typically are entitled to at least a $3 million grant annually, and then sometimes there are supplemental and additional grants that we can qualify for. And then finally, there is another fund called the Facility Charge Fund. It's another fund that has in the past collected fees on rental car transactions to pay for capital projects related to the rental car business. And as we are planning a future capital project called the South Airfield Development Project that touches on the rental car business, we do plan to begin collecting those fees again as we move forward with that project. So we'll talk more a little bit about that.
Ms. Zackerson, it looks like Mayor Pro Tem Snedden has a question.
Oh, absolutely.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's just a quick question. So is this proposed revenues, this is status quo, or is this our best projection given the new situation?
This is actually status quo. So you'll see that the passenger facility charge, for example, at 2.4 million, that is what was budgeted prior to COVID-19. So it will not likely, it will not be in that neighborhood, no.
So all these pages that have the B page references are all status quo budget
These are
references?
status quo, right.
Okay.
And we'll get to a little bit later where the CARES Act funding comes into that.
Thank you.
Alrighty, next slide. So with regard to expenditures in our operating fund, we'd like to note that we've made some cost reductions already in FY 2020 that are reflected in our projected expenditures coming in lower than the revised FY 2020 budget. Our total proposed expenditures are 26.5 million, and that includes spending on non-FAA grant eligible on the city general fund loan for the 6100 Hollister development and the state loan for the airport T hangars. We will continue obviously to look for means to cut costs, and in particular, to the degree that revenues fall short, we will elect to delay any spending eligible capital projects. So next slide. So these again are grant and charges fund, passenger facility service. But as I mentioned, the CARES Act funding will come into play here. Okay, next slide.
Ms. Clerk, it looks like we're having some issues with the feed from the airport. Should we take a break and see if we can, there she's back, but fuzzy to me. Can you see her okay? Mr. Kalan, you have advice?
You do need to recess if you can't have a presentation, or else move on to another item and come back.
Let's recess for 5 minutes and fix our issues. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. No, she's at home.
push the button? Or are we already on?
We're on.
Okay. We will reconvene this special meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council, our budget hearing, May 18th, 2020, and we're in the middle of our airport report. Please go ahead. We'll have Ms. Dina Zakrison without visual, but we can hear her voice. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor Murillo. So we should be back to page 18 in the slide presentation, which would be maybe it's 19, one more. We just finished talking about expenditures. Alrighty, so this slide is illustrative of our operating fund year-end reserves. And you can see here our reserves projected for year-end 2020. And you can also see here where the airport's award of the CARES Act fund is flowing into our finances. So as I mentioned, we do anticipate that we'll have roughly a $2.7 million shortfall, revenue shortfall in FY20, but this blow is cushioned by some of our cost reductions and the allocation of $4 million in CARES Act funding, leaving us with a reserve of $528,000 in FY20. And then we infuse another $5.5 million in CARES Act funding to support our budget in FY21, leaving us potentially with a reserve, perhaps a healthy one, in FY21. One of our short-term objectives is to make an early payoff on the loan that we have from the general fund for the 6100 Hollister development, which is about $2.6 million. I know we've mentioned that before, and we would like to see if it would be possible to pay that down early, because then we would be able to retain the revenues from that development instead of paying on the loan. So it's in our long-term best interests, of course. All right, on to capital investments. We'd like to touch a little bit on our airport capital program projects. So between this slide and the next, we show a total proposed capital budget of $12.4 million. However, the vast majority of that investment is paid for via federal airport improvement program grants. So typically the airport's cost for such a project would be a grant match of a little less than 10%, which we show examples of here. However, we have reason to believe that in the coming year, there may be more federal support available for airport capital projects that could ease some of that burden as well. On the next slide, you'll see that there's really only one major project that is not FAA funded, and that is the South Airfield Development Program, which is a project that's designed to create a more efficient use of space near the terminal on the south side. If revenues generated in the operation, and that's including from the rental car fund that I mentioned before, because that's part of this project, if they fail to provide the needed resources for this project, we would simply defer it until the funding is available. All right, next slide, we'd like to transition to the new normal, and this is where the budgetary impacts of COVID-19 comes in. Next slide. The very near term impacts, they've been dramatic. I mean, there's no question about it. The airport is providing air service at reduced levels, reflecting the lack of demand that exists right now. However, Santa Barbara, as well as all of the markets we serve, are fundamentally strong markets, and we are confident that service levels will eventually return. We do have some specific delays to new service, some temporarily suspended service. We also have one airline that joined us in 2018 and ceased service in March, but is planning to return as soon as there is evidence of enough demand. Next slide. From the standpoint of our budget planning, the most significant issue is that our key assumptions for the budget, they became irrelevant, unfortunately, with COVID-19. We projected a 20% growth in passengers, which was reasonable and even conservative, given that we grew by 27% in the last year. But instead, we'll likely see a significant loss. And even though it's likely to be a tough year for the rest of the year, we do think that there's reason to predict a recovery in 2021. We had projected that the parking revenues would continue in their upward trajectory, but it looks like there'll be a loss here as well, although we have been able to soften that blow with some cost reductions in the operation. Our rideshare revenues, that's Uber and Lyft, they are also very important for us, and they will likely fall below forecast. However, we could see a resurgence in demand for rental cars and even parking of own cars at the airport. Next slide. Again, rather than an increase, we are pretty assured that there's going to be a negative impact to our passenger facility charges. But again, the CARES Act will be shoring up that revenue shortfall. And we traditionally have very few vacancies in our commercial industrial properties, and that could increase, although we're pretty encouraged by the fact that none of our tenants have felt the need to take advantage of the temporary eviction moratorium ordinance, and we've had very few issues with late rental payments. On the recreational aviation side, we could see some impact to space rentals with impacts to disposable incomes if those are sustained. Next slide. Aviation has endured major crises in the past. If there's one thing that we know, one thing we've learned, is that air travel always recovers, and it eventually recovers beyond its previous highs. And there's a lot of experts out there right now with projections about how long the recovery is going to take, but fundamentally it's a demand-driven business, and for demand to return, we need to see recovery in the economy and in employment, and we need to see traveler confidence in the safety of flying. And of course, we're doing our part at the airport to make people feel safe. There are a number of positive signs already. We have been seeing a slow but steady increase in the number of passengers in the last few weeks, and we're hearing some really encouraging signs of optimism from the airlines. Next slide. So as I've already mentioned, we've experienced some impacts to our revenues over the last 2 months, but the impacts for 2021 are still pretty speculative, and primarily the magnitude of those is highly speculative. We do know that with fewer passengers, we'll collect less revenue in the passenger facility charges. Parking, we are likely to lose revenue there. But some of those revenue losses, of course, will be mitigated by the CARES Act funding. We will have some additional facility costs to accommodate distancing guidelines as we get more passengers in the building. And we are installing, for example, counter screens at ticket counters. We may have to make some other changes to accommodate more queuing space. The loss of demand in airport parking has meant we've been able to reduce some variable costs in the operation, and that's not an offset, but nonetheless, it's not like most of our fixed costs. And generally, we will see this as an opportunity to find ways to do things differently, more efficiently, and reduce costs. So as far as managing our budget proactively, when the pandemic hit, we identified about $1.2 million in cost reductions to help offset revenue losses, and combined with the CARES Act funding, will still balance the budget for FY20. With FY21, again, we would utilize another infusion of CARES Act funding to support operating costs. Nonetheless, we'll focus on maximizing revenue, identifying grant opportunities, reducing expenditures as we monitor our shortfalls. And again, we'll delay if necessary on airport capital projects if the money just isn't there for them. And we will continue to coordinate with our commercial air carriers on potential adjustments to rates and charges. And finally, last slide, even though the fiscal year didn't quite end as we had hoped, we still achieved some very significant milestones in FY20 that are by no means undone by the pandemic. We positioned ourselves well for the future by installing a new passenger boarding bridge, expanding aircraft capacity at Gate 1, and we converted all of our gates to shared airline use. And we're very happy that after a decade's absence, we welcome back Delta Airlines service to Salt Lake, which continues today. We're completing a much needed security system upgrade, and we now have new interim agreements in place for both of our fixed base operators for revenue stability while we redevelop that business over the next couple of years. So with that, I think Henry and I would be happy to take questions and love to come back on camera if the gods of the internet would allow it.
Sorry, I undid my camera. Mr. Thompson, welcome. Ms. Snedden, you want to start off with some questions for our airport staff? Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just two quick questions. One, it's a bit of good news. Thank you. It's nice to see something balanced without being completely decimated, and appreciate that. Good news. There are two quick questions. One, in the performance measures, page D7, there was just this noise complaints received and the expectation that it would go up from 705 to 10,000. Are we expecting that there might be 10,000 noise complaints in a year? That's one question. And then the second question is, what are we doing right now for passenger safety in terms of COVID? So you mentioned some things that we might be doing in the future and screening and spacing, but what's already in place for our passengers? And those are my two questions, and just appreciation that this budget looks okay.
Great. And I'll give that a try. Madam Mayor and Mayor Pro Tem Snedden, first of all, in respect to noise complaints, we did install a new tool at the airport last week in which members of the community are able to now file a noise complaint using their smartphone device. And so by adding that technology, we were anticipating a significant increase in the number of complaints. And so we did realize, I think we launched that product in September of last year. And so we did start to see a number of folks from the community. They were repeat reporters, but we had, for example, one member of the community that called in 400 complaints in 1 month. And so based upon that technology being introduced, we did see a significant increase in noise complaints.
Thank you for that clarification. It might be helpful to have projected unique complaints or something to be able to delineate whether you have 400 from a single individual versus
Yes,
10,000. It just looks like such an alarming number. Yeah.
It does, and we're still learning the tool, so we'll figure that out this next year here. In respect to the initiatives that we've undertaken in the terminal, as Deanna mentioned, we are in the process of installing barriers at the ticket counters to provide some separation between the ticket counter workers and the members of the public. We are also, as of last Friday, we implemented a face covering requirement to enter the terminal building. We are also employing social distance where required within the terminal. And so we've placed markers in strategic areas such as at the ticket counter and in the security checkpoint lines. It's not always 6 feet. We're not able to get that much, but we're trying to get as much social distance as possible. We're also enhancing our cleaning, and we are procuring equipment that actually sanitizes in addition to the cleaning of the hard surfaces that we're doing. So the measures that we're taking are recommendations by the industry, and so they're best practices that are occurring here in Santa Barbara.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Friedman, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. A few questions. I wanted to get to the last slide. You mentioned the interim with the fixed base operators. What is the status of the long-term extension, or not extension, bidding of the contracts? And related to that, when you're looking at the recovery of the airline industry, do we foresee that private service such as those that they would provide would increase quickly more rapidly than, say, commercial aviation? And then where I'm going with this is what's the time frame for the long term, and is there any opportunities to speed it up depending on what the time frame is?
So let me first say that our FBO partners at the airport, naturally, they've been impacted by COVID-19 as well. Probably not as much as on the commercial side of the operation, but they have been impacted. The agreements that we were able to negotiate with them last year is an interim step to getting to the new contracts that we will be bidding. What it does is these interim agreements buys us the needed time to move the FBO development project forward. So we believe that within the terms of those agreements, we'll be able to move things forward more quickly.
Okay, and then what's the time frame for the bidding and just the process to for that whole process?
You know, I've been careful with putting timelines out there because there are so many steps involved, but certainly within the next year or two, we will have the bids on the street out there. And as we get closer and are able to offer something more definitive, I'll definitely share that with you. But I'm just saying very broadly within the next year or two.
Okay. And then on slide 25, whoops, slide 25 on my own, I was a little confused on the projected increase in parking revenues. It says 4.8 million, but it says significant loss. What was it before? And then what's the significant loss that's there, and how are we projected to make that up?
I can address that if you'd like.
Go ahead, Deanna.
Yes, Mayor Murillo, Councilmember Friedman, I believe our revenues for 2020, and those will be impacted as well, we're somewhere around the neighborhood of 4.2 million. And of course, we predicted that we would see an increase to those revenues. That was obviously pre-COVID-19. So the significant loss, we have some estimates of what that loss might end up actually looking like. Maybe a 50% loss is possible, but that is exactly the kind of revenue loss that the CARES Act funding was designed to shore up. And we've tried to reduce costs as much as possible, and we're able to do that more so on the parking side because it's largely has to do with staffing and those kinds of things. But nonetheless, it's likely to be a loss in parking revenues. It's all tied to commercial traffic, of course.
That's helpful. So that is with CARES. Okay, and then my last question on the same, I think it's slide 26 actually. So just curious, it said that we're already seeing some passenger numbers increasing. Do we know what is driving the increase right now, being that we're still in shelter in place and we still have restrictions here in our community? Is there any indication of why that's taking place? And then kind of related, you might have mentioned this earlier, but it's kind of follow-up. Would we expect, to the extent we can, a quicker recovery in the commercial or in the private, where our fixed base operators would be seeing use?
Well, I can say that anecdotally, really from spending time in the terminal and looking at the passenger numbers as they're beginning to tick up, and actually we had close to 200 passengers yesterday, which is not a lot, but it's certainly more than we've had over the last 2 months. The travelers that we're seeing are primarily family travel. It's people that are traveling to see family or we're visiting family, not seeing a lot of evidence of business travel at this point. And there's a lot of speculation as to which parts of the total travel pie will recover more quickly. But most seem to be settling on that the leisure travel and particularly family oriented travel will be the first to rebound before business and convention travel.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Hi, Mr. Thompson. Really just have a couple questions with you, and they're kind of really follow on to the FBO question. So on the FBOs, what I understand in my limited knowledge is that there are literally FBOs ready to make capital improvements on your behalf and generate more revenue. And I'm just wondering how that fits in with your level of aggressiveness moving forward to help get out of this mess we find ourselves in all over.
Madam Mayor and Councilman Jordan, so we certainly believe that there is significant interest in the 2 contracts that we will be letting out for Santa Barbara. Exactly what those contracts will bring us is not really clear yet, because we're still in the development phase of those agreements and working with our consultants on developing what that RFP is going to bring us. So we do anticipate that the revenue we generate under these new agreements will be an improvement over what we have today, but we really can't speak to exactly how much it's going to improve the situation. I would venture to say that our air carrier business will rebound before we ever see the groundbreaking of the FBOs.
Okay. And then kind of a similar question, and hopefully you won't take me on a path of airport restriction talk. But of course, anytime you drive down Hollister Avenue, you're just struck with both the wonderful age and sense of the buildings, many of them that you own, and all the open space. And so could you, or just kind of a general question, or do you feel you're being aggressive enough in your real estate management processes to get a return there or build new stuff to help just be a little more help your portfolio of revenues just be a little more diverse than just hoping I get on an airplane?
Absolutely. We first of all are very focused on maintaining our existing inventory of properties. You know, as you mentioned, there's some aging properties out there, and they need a lot of attention. And so we're trying to direct whatever revenues we have available to shore up those aging properties. And then what comes to follow is development of other empty parcels that we may have out there. And, you know, they are in the planning phase at this point. But it's more conceptual, and our highest priority is on improving those facilities that we currently have that are generating revenue today.
So is there not a connection between either what's on the ground already and empty space and where the master plan is going to take your FBOs in terms of new facilities also? Is that not all tied together, sort of?
Somewhat, but not exactly. The master plan did address the FBO sites and the acreage that we were allocating towards that. And we've somewhat modified the FBO sites, but it didn't necessarily address all of our other properties that are off the airport. And so that's kind of a separate effort that we're really focused on attacking as revenue becomes available. But I might also point out that as we have challenges with our revenues, those older properties are the ones that are generally deferred. So
understood.
That's the challenge.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Are there any other questions for airport staff? I don't think so. Ms. Clerk, is there public comment? Speakers lined up to talk to us about the airport?
Madam Mayor and Council, not at this point.
To speak up?
Sorry, I'd put my mic away. Madam Mayor and Council, no speakers on this item at this point, just the one remaining attendee who has not indicated that he wishes to speak on this particular item.
Okay, well, this would be the time then for city council members to make any comments. We're receiving a presentation and people asked good questions, and I'm happy to see that you won't be touching your reserves and that our airport seems to be in good shape. We're grateful to the federal government for supporting the airport and all airports, right? We're not the only one that got some assistance.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see anyone popping up, and we have waterfront next. We love our airport and our waterfront equally. So Mr. Thompson, thank you. Ms. Zackerson, thank you. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thanks. So Ms. Clerk, I guess we're on the same item, right? So we don't need to read it. Mr. Casey, we're going to go to directly to Mr. Wiltshire. Okay, I guess let me just ask one thing of Mr. Casey before we go to you, Mr. Wiltshire. So for people who might think, oh, the airport has reserves, why can't we use airport reserves to pay for the library or other things in the general fund? I'm wondering if there's the public who, looking in on our budget doings, would ask, why can't we trade money around? Would you let us know that, please?
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. And if Mr. Thompson's still on board, he can pop up as well. FAA restrictions, as we mentioned, the airport is an enterprise fund, and it does get a lot of federal funding and support, but it's restricted funding that is legally required to be used for airport operations. So we are not legally allowed to move airport funds to support the general fund.
And Madam Mayor, that is absolutely correct. There are federal regulations that are actually law that restrict the use of revenues that are generated on airport property must be used on airport property. And any attempt to use those revenues for a purpose other than the airport would be considered revenue diversion and a violation of the law.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. So Mr. Wiltshire, Waterfront is also an enterprise department, and we're ready for your presentation. Thank you.
All right, well, good afternoon, Madam Mayor and council members. Good to see you all again. I'm Mike Wiltshire, City of Santa Barbara Waterfront Director, and I'll be presenting the FY21 budget for the Waterfront Department. I did want to take a second and give some credit to our waterfront staff, and more specifically our accounting supervisor, Damian Goodall, and business manager, Brian Bossy. They were integral and put a huge amount of work into putting this all together. Our business manager, Mr. Bossy, would typically lead this presentation, but he's unable to make it today as his daughter is graduating from Berkeley. So that seemed like much more of a lifelong memorable experience than our budget presentation. So you're stuck with me today. I also had today with me Mr. Carl Treiberg, our waterfront facilities manager, and Eric Engbretson, our acting harbor operations manager, if any questions come up in those divisions. I also want to take a minute and just echo Airport Director Thompson's sentiment that although these are truly unprecedented times, I'm optimistic that the waterfront department will weather the storm and manage through this and remain a vibrant and thriving place to do business and recreate. the staff down here and the waterfront community are capable and resilient, and it's been really rewarding to see the ingenuity and efforts that have been occurring even over the last couple months. So now that we're getting kind of used to this, I'm really excited to see all of that ingenuity thrive and kind of make it through the months and coming years. So if there's no initial questions, I'll get started with the presentation. Nick, oh no, stay on this slide. So yeah, so we'll start our presentation with a little background on the waterfront department, and then I'll move into our FY21 budget numbers, and I'll address some of the COVID related impacts and budget balancing strategies. And as with other departments, this will be presented in somewhat two parts, kind of pre and post COVID. So I'll try and be as clear as possible when we're talking about those two scenarios. And then I'll finish up with a few key performance objectives from the waterfront. Next slide. So here's the waterfront organizational chart. So the waterfront's made up of three divisions: our business services division, which is managed by Mr. Brian Bossy; harbor operations, which is managed by Eric Engbretson. He's our acting harbor operations manager. That position is currently vacant. And our facilities manager, Mr. Carl Treiberg. And I'll go into a little more detail on these divisions in the following slides. As far as our waterfront staffing breakdown, waterfront's made up of 47 FTEs with a breakdown as shown. And we are proposing two staffing changes in FY21. One of those changes is a reclassification of our parking supervisor to parking superintendent. So our parking operations have really grown and evolved over time and become a much more complex operation. And we really need this position to kind of more accurately reflect the current job duties. Our parking supervisor manages a huge amount of financial transactions as well as personnel actions for 60+ hourly employees. And we are proposing one additional FTE, a parking office specialist. So typically this role, the parking office specialist, has been handled by rotating hourlies. And the finance department and some past audits have requested tighter controls on this, as there's a huge amount of cash handling. And so the consistency of a full-time employee would be much more secure. And it should be noted that the full-time equivalent salary will be mostly offset by a reduction in hourly who previously filled this role. And it should also be noted that the waterfront department's only added one other permanent staff member in 18 years. So it's a fairly lean operation. It's been running very efficiently. Next slide. And so getting into some of our divisions, a little bit of overview of the waterfront department. As Mr. Casey mentioned, we are an enterprise fund, so the waterfront relies solely on revenues generated within the waterfront to run our operations. So we don't use any general fund or taxpayer dollars. And where the airport's governed by the FAA, the waterfront is governed by the California Tidelands Grant. So the waterfront department operates on land that was granted to the city in 1925 by the state Tidelands Grant. So in general, our waterfront revenue must only be used for waterfront operations within the Tidelands Grant area, which is roughly the land on the beach side of Cabrillo. So moving into our divisions, our business services division. One of the key roles of the business services division is looking after and managing our 61 tenant leases. And so these leases include restaurants, commercial, nonprofit, and much more. And they're located from Stearns Wharf to Harbor Business District and all throughout the harbor. And our tenant leases make up one of our largest sources of revenue for the waterfront department. In addition, they look after our parking operations. So waterfront looks after 10 public parking lots with over 3,000 spaces. And I really see our parking lots as an excellent resource for access to our waterfront. Annual permits are only $125 and parking's $2 an hour, and it provides great beach access and access to the waterfront businesses. So in addition to these outward facing services, our business services division looks after a lot of internal process, budget, billing, accounts payable, and just a management of a huge amount of financial transactions. Next slide. And we also have our harbor operations division. So one of the key components of harbor operations division is the harbor patrol. So there's 10 harbor patrol officers and one harbor patrol supervisor, and this is a 24/7 operation. It's a law enforcement operation. They cover the entire waterfront from Ledbetter to East Beach, along with all the surrounding oceans and waters and all of our marina. But in addition to harbor patrol, harbor operations also looks after all of our slip and marina management. So we are a marina with roughly 1,200 slips. And so the majority of those are recreational, but we also have commercial fishing slips, liveaboard slips, visitors. And so the harbor operations division is managing those transactions on a day-to-day basis, along with some various use permits. So our West Beach paddle racks and catamaran beach storage is also managed within this division. And I'll take this opportunity to take a break and pass it over to Mr. Treiberg if he's available to weigh in on the facilities division.
Good afternoon, Madam Mayor and Council. I manage the facilities division, as Mike just mentioned. We have two primary programs. The first is our capital improvement program, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in a couple of slides. And then repair and maintenance at Stearns Wharf in the harbor. Stearns Wharf is one of the oldest working wharfs in the state. It's about 2,000 feet long, 4 acres of deck, and is a wooden wharf. There's about 1,500 wooden piles that need to be maintained and inspected every year. Our harbor facilities, most everybody is familiar with the marinas themselves. This particular photograph is a picture of the end tie in Marina 2 that was just replaced by our staff. Our staff is quite versatile. We have 18 full-time employees and 6 hourly employees. They're experienced in all the trades. So we try to do a lot of this sort of work ourselves. It's very specialized and unique. Some of the bigger projects, as some of the council members may recall, a few years ago, we replaced all of Marina 1 and had to contract that out. But we do a lot of these things in-house. We also maintain the harbor patrol boats. We have 4 boats in the fleet. We have a heavy equipment operator that's responsible for maintenance of those and a vessel technician as well. A few years ago, we started a vessel reserve fund so that we wouldn't take such a huge hit on any given year when it's time to replace boats. You'll see that coming before your council here in a couple of years. We've got a couple of boats that are ready to be replaced, and it's a pretty big expense and a pretty big endeavor and quite a challenge to build a new boat. It's one of the unique aspects of what we do. In general, that kind of covers what we do in the facilities division, and in a few slides, I'll talk a little bit more about our capital projects.
All right, thank you, Carl. Next slide. Getting into the numbers a little bit. So these are our revenue profile down at the waterfront. The numbers themselves are pre-COVID, so this would be our status quo revenue numbers. But I'm going to use this as kind of a way to give a scope and scale of where our revenues are coming from. So starting in the top right with commercial leases. And so these are non-restaurant leases located on Harbor and Stearns Wharf. So things like Harbor Marine Works, Channel Islands Outfitters, yacht sales, and the winery, and things like that. And so you can get an idea that that's roughly 12% of our revenue makeup. And then our food-related leases, which are restaurants. So some of the well-known restaurants, Brophy Brothers, Harbor Restaurant, Sushi Go-Go, Shoreline Beach Cafe. So those make up a fairly big portion of our revenue profile at 20%. And then some smaller other leases, which are kind of non-commercial and non-food based, which are things like the Yacht Club, UCSB Sailing, NOAA offices, and those make up a smaller portion, but 2% of our revenue profile. We also have some interest, and that's really just interest revenue from our reserves and investments, and parking fees and permits, which is a big portion of our revenue pie. So our parking lots bring in about 19%, I believe that says, 19% of our revenue. And slip rentals, which is a big part of our revenue. It's a big part of our business. We're a marina, and we have roughly 1,200 slips. And so between recreational, liveaboard, and commercial slips, we bring in about 30% of our revenue through slips. In addition to our permanent slip fees, we have visitor slips. And so these are people who are visiting, they're transient, and we have a number of slips available for them to come in for any amount of time they'd like to stay. Slip transfer fees. So these are the fees that are paid to the waterfront when boats and slips change hands. And there's some history behind the slip transfer fee, and I'm happy to get back to it with anyone who has any interest, but this is a fee that is paid to the city kind of prevent the private purchase of slips for investment and kind of make sure that the marina and the harbor maintain their usage as a boat related and an ocean related operation. And our liveaboard fees, which are a small portion of our portfolio. We have about 100 liveaboards. We're not currently at capacity. It usually makes up about 10% of our total slips. And then miscellaneous revenue at 6%. So these include some miscellaneous things, electricity cost recovery. One of the big ones within that is cruise ship revenue. And I'll talk about cruise ship revenue a little more later on. Next slide. So the previous was our revenues. This is the same sort of pie, but this is where we spend our money. So this is our pre-COVID expenditures. So again, the numbers are pre-COVID status quo, but the intent is to kind of see where our expenditures break down. So starting in the top right at admin support. So this mainly includes salaries, benefits, the MTD waterfront shuttle, and city overhead and allocations get paid out of this portion. Property management, this program is mainly a revenue account, but does have some expenditures with some salaries and benefits and supplies. Financial management, again, mainly a revenue account, but includes some salaries. One of the big line items in our financial management program is credit card fees. So we have a huge number of transactions, and the associated credit card fees with those make up a big portion of those expenses. Parking services, again, mainly revenue, but it does include salaries of parking staff and hourlies and some maintenance of equipment and parking facilities. Harbor patrol is a larger portion of our expenditures and includes mainly salaries, training, and we also do pick up a portion of the beach lifeguard program. And marina management includes salaries, parade of lights, oil recycling, and all these sort of things that would sort of fit into marina management, some maintenance. And our facilities maintenance portion, which is the largest portion of our expenditures, kind of maintains everything we have down here. So this includes salaries and benefits of all of our facilities maintenance staff, custodial and vehicles and utilities and this sort of thing. And facilities design and capital. So that includes some salaries, but mainly benefits and debt service on our loans and design for some capital projects. Next slide, please. All right, the waterfront did propose some fee increases for this year. All three of these fee increases were approved by Finance Committee on May 12th. So we proposed a slip fee increase of 2%. This is pretty in line with our historic slip fee increases. And it should be noted that we do an annual survey of marinas kind of from Santa Cruz down to San Diego, and generally Santa Barbara is on the lower end of marina slip fees. And the goal with the increase of slip fees is to ensure we have at least enough of an increase to keep up with inflation and avoid the need for a kind of a larger catch up down the road. And so the intent of these slip fees is to maintain and cover the cost of the operation of running a marina. And we've been historically successful with a 2% increase. And so we were sticking with that for this year. Slip permit transfer fee. So this is in line with historic slip transfer fees, and this only applies to vessels larger than 30 feet. So it's going up $25 per foot. And so it will take it to $525 per foot for slips and vessels larger than 30 feet when they transfer. And our West Beach rack permit, a $50 increase from $1,150 to $1,200 for a 6-boat rack. And so this is a really nominal revenue increase. I mean, we're looking at a few $100s a year to the waterfront, but again, the intent is sort of a cost recovery to make sure that we can manage this program successfully going forward. And with the West Beach rack permits, the demand most often really exceeds the capacity for these racks. And so we're really trying to stay on top of that program and ensure that we recover some of the cost to manage it. Next slide, please. We put this slide in here just to kind of show the cost impact of the 2% slip increase. I know this has come up in the past and it's always of interest. And so just for an example, if you look at the slip fee of say a 40-foot boat, their monthly fee would increase by, what is that, $8.40. And so that would be a monthly increase from about $412 a month to roughly $420 a month for a 40-foot boat. So this was intended just to kind of put it in perspective of what the slip fee increase creates. All right, I'm going to pass it over again to Mr. Triberg. He's going to go over our capital program.
Madam Mayor and Council, our FY21 pre-COVID capital program is fairly typical for the waterfront at about $2.5 million. We have several projects associated with security, one of which is improving the parking lot lighting in the Harbor Main lot. It's quite old. We've done some preliminary work, and we think we could significantly increase the lighting and still use about the same amount of electricity using some modern methods. So we're looking forward to pushing that one forward. Marina renovation is the photo I showed you in the previous slide. When we rebuild portions of a marina at a time, we use this $275,000 to purchase all those materials. Parking infrastructure improvements has to do with our self-pay program, our ski data system for access control into the lots. Parking lot maintenance program. This is the slurry work that you see a lot of public works does. We piggyback on their larger contracts, and that's applying a coat of asphalt slurry, usually to 1 or 2 lots every year. We'd like to renovate the maintenance shop. Our maintenance shop's quite old. It's underutilized, and this has been on the books for quite some time. So we'd like to push forward with that. That's what we had proposed. Stearns Wharf has 3 lift stations, and this is to push the sewage off of the wharf from all the restaurants and the public restrooms. They operate reasonably well, but it's 1980s technology, and it's one of these things that you just kind of can't let it break. So we try to get a little bit ahead of these things and design these upgrades and make these improvements before they fail. Similar with the waterline replacement project that you see beyond that. Stearns Wharf heavy timber and pile replacement. As I mentioned, we have 1,500 wooden piles on the wharf, 4 acres of wooden deck. So every year we spend at least $475,000 to go and replace those timbers. We inspect them every year. We inspect about 500 piles every year from the mud line all the way to the deck with our dive crew. And another safety program we want to promote is updating our security camera system. We actually have an FY20 project. We're trying to move forward, and assuming we get it funded and built out, this is actually phase 2. It's kind of ripe for Department of Homeland Security port security grant program that we applied for last year and didn't get. But as the second phase, we feel pretty strongly about that. So that's what that next project is. That's it for the capital.
All right.
Thanks. Does any of the city council members have questions at this point? We're getting a lot of information, but good. Ms. Sneddon, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I did have a quick question. I think, so we have the like 2.44 for capital programs, but then we also have about a little over 4 million for facilities maintenance. And if you could just help me understand when you put it in one column versus the other column. I understand it all needs to be done. I just, the delineation of when it's maintenance and when it's capital.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Sneddon, on the operating side is kind of the more of the day-to-day maintenance. We have what we call a minor capital improvement program. And these are projects that are less than $100,000. For example, replacing 1 or 2 finger docks at a time in some of the marinas. It's a capital improvement, but it's done by staff. The material is paid for out of the capital fund, but the actual work is done out of the operating side. We maintain 18 buildings, so we have quite a bit of work to do with just on the operating side of things. The capital improvements are typically, as you'll see for the rest of the city, everything over $100,000 that have a life expectancy of over 5 years. Most of these are 20 and 30-year projects. So that's the basic difference, if that answers your question.
So if it's over 100,000, so then the on page B15, the facilities maintenance line item that's 4.9 million about, is that all things that are under 100,000 that add up to?
Yes, that's correct. That's salaries and benefits, and about half of that is salaries and benefits, and the other half supplies and services, custodial supplies, large custodial program. So that's all on that side.
Thank you. I didn't understand that. So facilities maintenance includes salaries.
That's true. That's correct.
Thank you. That answers my question. Thank you.
Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll just get a question out of the way before you leave this section. Mr. Wiltshire, that fee adjustment page was the only fee increases next year. So parking is going to stay the same, for example?
That's correct. We were kind of going through our fee adjustment process right prior to COVID. So we had some other fee increases potentially proposed for this year, but we scaled it back quite a bit to the 3 that you see in front of you for FY21.
And then can you tell me a little bit about what the status is with City College's use, what their fees are, if that's if the number of those that are issued is staying flat or decreasing, that kind of thing?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Jordan, I don't have those numbers offhand. In general, I believe we are using that lot because they are not in service or they are not in session now. So the way the arrangement had it in the best of my knowledge is that we would have access to that lot on weekends when they weren't in session. But now since they're not in session, we do have access. But I can get back.
No, I mean, I'm sorry, flip it around. I'm talking about when they're in session and their use of your lots.
Correct. Yes, that arrangement still stands. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, and before they broke up and went their way, are those passes, are those numbers that are issued pretty flat, staying the same?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Jordan, again, I don't have those numbers offhand, so can't speak to it, but I'll get back to you.
I'll get back to you. I'll shoot you an email. Thanks. Sorry.
No problem.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay, let's carry on. Your next slide was estimated revenue impacts. Oh no, bad news, sort of? Go ahead.
Well, yeah, this is where we shift gears a little bit. And so everything before this was sort of pre-COVID and a layout of the waterfront department. But so now we can move into the post-COVID budget impacts. And so this slide's a bit of a snapshot on our anticipated revenue losses for FY21. And so again, as of now, we don't know the extent of the economic impacts, but we made some projections based on recent months and numbers, along with some predictions of where we think this may go in the coming months and years. And so as mentioned, we are an enterprise fund, and so we'll be balancing to our predicted revenue losses and matching with our own specific expenditure reductions. And as opposed to a flat rate target, such as a 5 or a 10% target, we're getting a little more granular with our revenue categories and anticipating our losses for FY21. So you can see here our three major areas where we anticipate revenue losses in the coming year. So property management and tenant leases by far our biggest impacts. So we collect percentage rents, which decline with a reduction in sales, and there's certainly the potential for hardships with restaurants and other tenants, and even some potential closures throughout the year. As of now, the waterfront tenancy is at 100%. So optimistically, we stay that way through the coming year, but it's going to be a tough road ahead. And even our commercial leases, there's various impacts to non-restaurant businesses, charters, rentals, sales. So they're all kind of in limbo right now. And a lot of this is dependent on payback of deferred rents. So all of our rents are collected on an accrual basis. So from an accounting point of view, if these rents get paid back a year from now, they'll go back on the books for fiscal year 21. So a lot of it is dependent on how some of these programs play out and how capable some are of repaying these rents. So a number of our 60 plus tenants have chosen to defer rents based on the city's temporary eviction moratorium ordinance for this month and last month. And so we're not collecting those rents at the moment, but it's still up in the air to how those are going to be negotiated over the coming year on how those rents will be paid back. And so our anticipation is a 15% reduction to our tenant lease revenue, or $750,000. And cruise ship revenue. So historically, the waterfront brings in about $300,000 or $400,000 a year in fees directly to the waterfront from cruise ships. And this is in addition to the $3 or $4 million economic boost to the local economy that that Visit Santa Barbara had provided. We had 25 cruise ships that were planned to visit Santa Barbara in FY21, scheduled between September and May. And so as of now, we're being conservative with that. The city and the public seem really reluctant to rush back into accepting cruise ships, and I can totally understand this. So for a budgeting purposes, we've anticipated that virtually all 25 scheduled visits in FY21, so this coming fall, winter, and all of next spring will either be canceled or postponed. So that portion of the budget is removed. In addition, our parking services. So as of now, our parking services are operational and people use our waterfront lots to come to the beach and harbor and businesses and events, and they'll continue to do so. But there is a real legitimate potential for reductions in events and overall reduced traffic to restaurants and other businesses, which will most certainly reduce use of our waterfront parking lots. So we're anticipating a 10% reduction in our parking revenues for FY21. And so as far as our revenue target goes, as of now, the total is that we're anticipating a little over $1 million, 1.34 million in shortfall revenues. So that's sort of our target, and we've been working pretty tirelessly to find out how we can balance that with expenditure reductions in the coming year. And so I'm going to pass it back to Mr. Treiber to talk about capital, because capital projects are going to make up a huge portion of how we kind of throttle and meet this reduction. So I'll let Mr. Treiber talk about that.
Well, Ms. Sneddon has popped up. Did you have something at this juncture, ma'am?
Yeah,
Okay.
just very quickly, Madam Mayor, thank you. Is the Endless Summer Cafe, are those leases for the harbor or the waterfront, or are those separate leases?
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Mayor Pro Tempore Sneddon, the Chuck's Waterfront Grill and Endless Summer was one lease with the waterfront, and those owners have been going through a lease assignment process to sell their lease over the last, I don't know, 6 or so months. So the timing was odd. It wasn't a COVID related maneuver, but there is a new owner now there as of basically this month. So a new owner has assumed that lease and is planning to perform renovations over the coming months and open a new restaurant in that location.
Oh, thank you. So it's still at 100%, even with that changeover. Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Keep going.
Madam Mayor and Council, we have a couple of strategies for reducing our possible expenditures of the capital program for next year. A lot of the projects we have at the waterfront are kind of complicated and unique and require significant design effort, as well as everything we have is in the original permit jurisdiction for the Coastal Commission. So the permitting process can be somewhat time consuming. So we have 3 projects we think we can focus on the design part of it and then defer the actual construction until FY22 or later. The first is renovation of the maintenance shop. We haven't designed anything yet, but we can probably get quite a ways down the road with the design by spending $50,000 this year and deferring $100,000. The lift stations on the wharf, lift stations on wharfs are very, very unique. We have a conceptual design. We don't have a final design. We've looked at other lift stations on other wharfs, for example, in Santa Cruz, but it's kind of a complicated one. So I think next fiscal year, we can dedicate a lot of effort to the design and permitting and have it kind of teed up and ready to go with a construction cost probably close to $500,000 in fiscal year 2022. And then as well as the water line replacement. The water lines on the wharf, we replaced all the laterals several years ago, and those are the ones that are under the deck. The main water line is up on the top of the deck, so it's easy to inspect and easy to repair. So we feel if we can just work on the design of that and then go ahead and do the capital outlay in a future fiscal year, we'll be in good position. So that's just a summary and totals of about $800,000 in possible savings from our capital program to help deal with the reduction in revenues this year.
It looks like Mr. Jordan has a question.
Just a quick one. I'm sure you guys have heard this too, but I've gotten some concern over the status of the ice building, the ice place renovation. And is that still on track this year, next year, or is it threatened by budget reductions?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Jordan, we're in the process of the design this year. It's another one of these kind of very complicated projects. We've got a design team that's working on it. We've got a preliminary design and going through the permitting right now. The actual construction will probably happen in FY21, although it's FY20 dollars that just will carry over as part of the capital improvement program. But yeah, we have every intention of going forward with that project as quickly as we can.
Thank you so much.
All right, next slide. Thanks, Carl. All right, so here is an overall summary of our proposed expenditure reductions. And so this is our balancing strategy for FY21. So as Mr. Triberg mentioned, and he spoke in detail on our capital projects program and outlined our proposed $800,000 in reduced spending in capital for 21. And so as with a number of other departments, capital is often used as a throttle for expenditures during tough times. And so this can be kind of increased or decreased throughout FY21, depending on how our revenues play out. So it's a real shame to reduce capital by this much because these are critical projects. This is maintenance that needs to happen, and they can only be pushed out so far. So we'll use this as kind of our main throttle as we go through the coming year to see where the dollars play out. Next on the list is the waterfront shuttle. So the city, Public Works and Waterfront funds a roughly $1.3 million contract with MTD for the downtown and waterfront shuttle services. The waterfront covers $310,000 of that for the waterfront shuttle. And so the city's proposing canceling the service for FY21 as these funds are really needed for critical operations. Next down the list is supplies and services. So this was really just combing through all of our program budgets and cutting things like equipment rentals, printing and binding, training and travel, postponing some vehicle purchases, postponing some facilities maintenance, and delaying computer and equipment and software upgrades. And so that got us another $130,000. As far as salary savings go, we anticipate holding at least a position vacant partially into FY21 and anticipate reducing some hourly services and salaries, mainly in our parking operations. And 4th of July fireworks, I'd love to hear from you on this. This is a kind of a big one. So we would like to discuss and receive some input on the 4th of July fireworks. So although this is a relatively small savings, this does come out of the waterfront budget. And I just don't know if we're going to be ready for large gatherings in the tens of thousands by 4th of July. And unfortunately, we need to make this decision now if we're going to award a contract or not. So that's sort of that $60,000 question. And so if I'll take a minute now, if council would want to weigh in on 4th of July fireworks, but as of now, our gut is telling us that it just feels like the responsible decision to postpone at least the fireworks portion of this event as opposed to outlaying those funds.
Well, the floor is open then for our city council members to weigh in on that. It doesn't seem like the threat of pandemic would be lifted by then. Certainly, we still have positive cases emerging, and it seems like large crowds is the last thing that the governor and the public health officials would approve.
Okay.
Mr. Gutierrez.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. When you say canceling the fireworks, does that mean all the activities on the beach, or can the fireworks still go on and we not allow people on the beach and they could see it from the sidewalks or the streets?
Mayor Murillo, Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez, that's a great question. The time sensitive thing right now is the fireworks. So we're kind of up against the wall on needing to either award a $60,000 contract or not. I believe all those things are options. It could be pretty tough from an enforcement point of view to keep people away while the fireworks are going on. But no, this would only be the fireworks portion. So if by the 4th of July we're in the clear and things are looking better. There's nothing stopping any other events or some of the other things that are associated with 4th of July. This is really just kind of the first domino in the time sensitive things of outlaying dollars on 4th of July.
And how much more is there an increase in law enforcement and the amount of money that is allocated to enforce safety during that day?
Let's have Mr. Casey respond to that.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. Yeah, it's an extensive law enforcement effort for 4th of July and a couple of other very large events. And so there is a financial impact of trying to manage the crowds. You know, unfortunately, I think our feeling is that we have such a tradition of getting, I think, hundreds of thousands of people down to the waterfront for the fireworks, that to somehow message that the fireworks are happening, but practice social distancing, we just find that really hard to see how that would be successful to achieve.
Okay, I feel like I need to hear from my other council members to see how they feel about it.
Ms. Gutierrez, go ahead.
Is there a way that we can televise the fireworks? During this pandemic, I think having the fireworks would be a tradition that we could continue and probably bring some joy into our homes, but not having people on the beach, and maybe we can televise it. But I do understand the crowd control component. It's just an idea.
Thank you. Mr. Jordan.
I'm kind of flummoxed that we are where we are right now and being asked to do what we do and trying to commit to something that's literally less than 2 months away. So, and also just even if you said we were going to have it, but nobody can go there, you're going to have to lock down and patrol all the West Beach and shorefront properties just to keep the outliers from going down there. So I think it's just a fatality this year, and we'll all need to look for other ways to celebrate, just as we're doing with everything in our daily life right now.
Ms. Sneddon, and then Mr. Friedman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm wondering if we might have public comment on this too before we're asked to sort of weigh in on our final thoughts on this. But it is hard for me to imagine that we could safely host the fireworks, but it is such a symbol of freedom in our country that it would be nice to have maybe this isn't through the waterfront budget, but through a different way, some type of aerial celebration that could be visible from homes if that was possible. But I can't see having a large scale fireworks event. And maybe we postpone it. And I guess that would be a question for if we could, with the contract, is it, maybe we postpone it until we have a celebration of reopening of the state or something like that. But I guess I would like to hear some public comment, and just for at this point, it's very hard to imagine our traditional 4th of July full out celebration.
Okay, thanks. Go ahead, Mr. Friedman.
I was going to wait for public comment, but I'm happy to just opine briefly. It is a tradition, but we're being asked all kinds of ways to sacrifice this year. I mean, solstice is changed, as well as fiesta, everything in the summer that's up there. So it would be very hard to enforce any measures down there for limiting it. And in addition, right now we have this huge deficit that we're trying to address, and that's $60,000 this year. So that could be some of our capital budget, or it just helps us get there, and we have to look at everything. So being that it's unlikely, given the current circumstances, that we would not have the ability to have our normal 4th of July, I would say it's an unfortunate something that we're going to have to postpone this year.
Thanks. Let's keep going, and then we'll see if there's public comment. it looks like you have a couple of other slides, sir.
Yes, yes. I will continue. The other thing that I would like a little input on is I put kind of a last minute asterisk at the bottom here. So we just received some news as of Friday, May 15th. So Beacon, who is the Beach Erosion Authority for Clean Ocean and Nourishment, and they are an organization represented by Santa Barbara, Ventura, Goleta, Carr, Oxnard, I believe Channel Islands. And so they're proposing a 100% fee increase which would put us from Santa Barbara's portion of that fee from about $21,000 to $42,000. So I was also seeking a little bit of council input on this increase, and this is something that would hit the waterfront budget directly. And I know Councilmember Friedman's very, very involved and knowledgeable.
Yeah, let's hear from you, Mr. Friedman. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. To provide some context, I am the council's appointed rep to Beacon, and what's happened, it's just unfortunate timing, as is many things these days, is for the last at least decade or so, Brian Brennan, who has been the director of Beacon, and he works in County Supervisor Steve Bennett's office. Before that, he was on the Ventura City Council. He donated his time as the director for Beacon. So we never actually had a director outside of any of the pro bono work that he was able to do or was offered by the office that he worked for. So what's happened is, with all the changing state mandates and sea level rise and all the planning and a real push by the state to do regional coordination, is Beacon is looking to enhance its role. And it's the 2 counties plus all the coastal cities, so Port Hueneme, as mentioned, all the way up to City of Goleta. And as we have our own sea level rise subcommittee, many of the issues we're facing are not just, most of them, in fact, all of them are not just within our own city. There's regional impacts, and the economies of scale and the professional expertise that we could get from a Beacon that is professionalized and has more scientific expertise is worth it, and it will help us in the other efforts that we're engaging in. And keep in mind, all the agencies together are contributing it, so we're getting a very for basically $21,000 extra, we're getting that professional service, but all of us are, and it will help us with a lot of technical studies and things going forward. And it would be a key component of our sea level rise plan that we're working on in our subcommittee. So that's the reason for it, and I am supportive of it, as are most of the other representatives there. And I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody has them of me as well.
Okay, Ms. Sneddon, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm also in support of this. I know it's difficult to increase the line item when we're looking at these budgets, but we really need to support, I believe we really need to support the regional efforts of Beacon, and especially with sea level rise. And this makes it a very professional and official part of the budget. And I'm supportive of this change.
Very good, thanks. Can we keep going, Mr. Wiltshire?
Yes, absolutely. Just a couple more slides, not long now. So a couple key performance objectives from the waterfront. The first one being develop a marketing campaign for wharf and harbor merchants. I wanted to highlight this because it's kind of more important now than ever. So waterfront staff is here, and it's part of our objective to support harbor and wharf businesses as we come back online. We plan to work with the City Economic Development Manager, Mr. Harris, and the Business Advisory Task Force to ensure the waterfront is looped in and a part of that conversation. And the other key performance objective is returning 95% of customer phone calls within 24 hours. So I thought this one was very timely as well. It's really a customer service metric, and important as a significant amount of our business is now being handled by phone or online. So in that time of change, it's critical for us to remain responsive. Next slide, please. And 2 more performance objectives. So survey slip permittee via dock line. So this was really the goal of this was to intend that we stay plugged in to those who we serve. So solicit feedback from the 1,200 slip holders on security measures and potential improvements. And so, as Mr. Treiberg mentioned, you saw we are prioritizing some safety related capital projects because this is the thing we're hearing time and time again from slip holders. So we're kind of paying attention to that. And Mr. Triberg also spoke about our marina finger replacements. And so this is really just an example of our bread and butter maintenance that really has to happen yearly and regularly. The ocean is a really, really tough environment for facilities and equipment. And so it's pretty amazing that we can perform all this work in-house with maintenance staff, which saves money and provides a lot of flexibility. So I just wanted to highlight that. Next slide. All right. Well, so yeah, I guess in closing, as you're well aware, you're kind of seeing it with all departments. These are unprecedented times, but we're still in the middle of it, and the waterfront department's optimistic. And so I've shown you how we can balance our revenues and expenditures in a fairly reasonable way. And it's my hope is that we can pursue through this and still be the vibrant place on the waterfront that everybody knows. And I'm looking forward to being a part of a ingenuitive team to get there. So thank you. I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Well, let me start by asking to remind me when the Big Harbor Festival is. What time of year is that again?
Madam Mayor, it's in October. So I think mid-October this year. So it's still very much a maybe on our list.
Okay, so that's a maybe. Let me ask if there, you have questions. Mr. Gutierrez, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So what is the plan for 4th of July? Because regardless if we have fireworks or not, people are still going to go to the beach. Are we going to have enforcement out there to just, are we going to close down the beach, the pier, the harbor? What's the plan?
Mr. Casey or Mr. Wiltshire, we would do beach management like we've been doing so far, but who wants to take that question? Mr. Casey, Mr. Wiltshire?
I'm easy. I can speak to the waterfront part, Mayor Murillo. I mean, the thing with the 4th of July is we have time there. And so we're getting kind of well versed with being able to shut down beaches and shut down our parking lots pretty quickly and ramping up enforcement. And so I don't know if that's a decision we need to make now, where the fireworks kind of is a little more time sensitive, but we still have time to make those decisions and collaborate with PD and fire like we have been. So we could see where we're at that time. But Mr. Paul Casey, I'm happy to hear if you've got any addition.
No, I kind of agree with that, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez. We still have a couple weeks away. It's a couple months away. It is something we've already started thinking about because I believe the 4th of July falls on a Saturday this year, which tends to be a day when people more get out and celebrate. And beach will definitely be impact fireworks or not. I think having fireworks would bring more people down. Just because you tend to close Cabrillo Boulevard and just get a lot of full day. We're going to have to look at the 4th of July, see where the guidance is from public health professionals, see what our neighbors are doing and manage that weekend as best we can. It's a challenge, you're right.
Okay. Yeah, I guess the argument is that having fireworks would just attract more people than are already going to be going out there. I just hope that the general public doesn't take it as us not being patriotic.
Madam Mayor and Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez, that's the exact conversation we had internally as we debated this as well. And I think where we came down to is what the guidance has been for kind of like large sporting events with spectators and such, that is in stage 4 reopening. And the state has kind of been foretelling that they don't see stage 4 large concert sporting events happening until next calendar year. So we didn't see any real possibility that July 4th was going to be something that they would encourage those types of large gatherings. And we do think that the fireworks are beautiful. It's a Santa Barbara tradition, but it's a tradition that brings hundreds of thousands of people regionally to the Santa Barbara waterfront. So we were just trying to be cautious about that.
Okay. Yeah, and if you have any idea when you'll present us some kind of plan as to what we're going to do for 4th of July to control the crowds or to deter the crowds from coming?
Yeah, Madam Mayor and Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez. We'll be monitoring that really closely as we get closer. And again, like I said, get guidance from the state and the county and see what our neighboring jurisdictions are going to do. We're not going to be the only ones having a 4th of July crowded event that's a tradition. So I think we're going to be in this with a lot of other communities trying to figure out how best to manage.
There's no estimate as to when you think they'll address that, because it's getting close, you know.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Oscar Gutierrez. No, quite honestly, you know, the governor just made a major announcement today about reopening to stage 2. And so I think they're working on different incremental steps, and we'll address the 4th of July as we get closer. I haven't heard any conversation at the state or county level about 4th of July preparations, but I can guarantee you it'll come as we get closer.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, questions, and then we'll check and see if anyone's waiting in public comment. Go ahead.
Oh, mine was just an up.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Madam Mayor. Mine's just an updated that I've been swayed, and I don't see how we could possibly have the fireworks. I just weighing in on that. Sadly, and understanding all the implications. Councilmember Friedman's comments about that there are so many sacrifices happening in so many festivals, and I think for the safety of our community, this is the best choice.
Thanks. Mr. Friedman.
Thank you. Just real quick on the 4th of July, just to add, we also have to look at what other communities are doing, because if they don't have it, then we run that issue that we have that we would have it, it would draw more pressure. So just as we look at that. So I do have a question, and I don't know if it's Mr. Wiltshire or Mr. Triberg, but I wanted to seek an update. I know there was a project of with the fishermen and trying to find fisher storage for our commercial fishermen that we were working on, you know, a few months back, going into last year. If that project is still taking place or if it's on hold. It was more of just gathering information at the time, and just wanted to see if that's something we're still going to be looking at, or that's going to be delayed.
Yeah, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Friedman, I can take a crack at that. A lot of the meeting type things were put on hold, so we've missed our last 2 Harbor Commission meetings, pretty primarily due to COVID and coronavirus. We're having our first Harbor Commission meeting this Thursday, and the commercial fishermen will be speaking at that. I'm also in the process and working with them to schedule a commercial fishermen subcommittee. So we're kind of very much trying to breathe life back into that operation and be supportive of them. You're right, to date, the efforts have been geared around identifying parcels and kind of being supportive on the city end. And so we're basically just at the stage where we're going to be getting back into that where we left off a few months ago. And so I'm looking forward to that in the next week or 2. So we'll have more to report after that.
Well, that's encouraging that we're still moving on that. I think it's very important to support our local fishermen in that endeavor. Thank you.
I don't see any other questions. We'll ask Ms. Gorman if there's people waiting to speak to the waterfront department.
Madam Mayor and Council, there are no public speakers on this item.
Okay, we'll close public comment, and the floor is open if there's any closing remarks for our beautiful waterfront, our well-run waterfront. And we know that when visitors are allowed to return, when there's pleasure travel again, people will come to our beaches and our waterfront. So thanks for taking good care of that, Mr. Wiltshire. Go ahead, Ms. Snedden, comments?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just, yes, I mean, I share appreciation for our waterfront, and it's such a central location. I think it's going to be difficult with the deferred sort of maintenance that's laid out that are such necessary things. So I appreciate that you can break it into design and then into implementation later, and sensitive to that, you know, can't be put off forever, and that we really need to be also looking long-term sea level rise also. So just keeping in mind that those are, that 800,000 is a temporary displacement of fund. And then I appreciate the discussion about that Councilmember Frieden brought up about the commercial fishermen and those projects. And then, oh, I had one more comment and I forgot it, but just much appreciation actually for the waterfront. Oh, Yes, just for cruise ships, I think I'm very grateful that this budget excludes cruise ships for fall, winter, spring next year. And I think long term, we need to be looking at that for the viability of our city, if we have to have that or not. And I'm leaning towards phasing that out myself. And I know it's a larger council discussion decision and with tourism industry, but I'm thankful that that was not included in this fiscal year's budget, and I'm glad to see that we can make it work without it. And thank you.
Any other comments from the city council on the waterfront budget or the issues we've been discussing? Mr. Wiltshire, if you would come back, it seems clear that the public health guidelines are preventing large-scale public events. And if you need to make the decision now to cancel fireworks, then I believe our council is supportive of that with a lot of regret. It'll save $60,000. And there may be a community group that's going to plan something that we can participate in to celebrate our Independence Day and find a way that we can be patriotic and enjoy. But if you need to go ahead and make that decision now, I'm getting a sense from the council that we would take a cautious public health perspective and say that to not order fireworks for now. And if something changes, then maybe we can do another kind of on the ground celebration. But even July seems like really close to the time we are right now, being very, very careful in terms of the virus infection. So.
Thank you.
Okay, but we should close on a good note. So you do have a farmer's, not a farmer's market, but a fisherman's market, right? Let's close on that note. Tell us about that.
Yes, Mayor. No, every Saturday, the commercial fishermen here in Santa Barbara have a market on the pier right out in front of Brophy's Brothers. So if you're looking for fresh seafood or something local, then please do support them on Saturdays. They're down here selling their products.
And of course, there's social distancing and people are wearing face coverings, and it's fresh fish and good for you. And so we do encourage people to enjoy our waterfront and just to make sure that you're being healthy about it. We'll thank you and Mr. Triberg and everyone else on your staff for your good work. And we'll close the waterfront department item.
Thank you.
And thank you. And I think we should take a 5-minute break. Ms. Bjork, would you be okay with us just taking a little break? There's a lot of technology involved in presenting this kind of budget hearing. Mr. Kalan? Yes, a thumbs up.
I welcome it myself.
We're in recess for 5 minutes. Thank you. capital funds discussion. Any introduction, Mr. Casey, or should we go right to Ms. Bjork? Right to Ms. Bjork. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mayor Murillo and council members. I am Rebecca Bjork, Public Works Director, and I'm here today to present an overview of the city's capital program. Next slide, please. I want to focus primarily on Measure C and General Fund, because those are the two that are not departmental, whereas most of the other capital projects on this table that I will be covering shortly are from enterprise funds. And so they are going to be presented, as you saw with the waterfront and airport, they will be presented in their budget presentations. But today for General Fund and Measure C, I've highlighted the two amounts up top, and you'll see that we are looking at some substantial adjustments to make up for what we anticipate to be reduced revenues in the coming year. But with the next slide, I wanted to also give you a snapshot of the current expectation for the city's total capital budget, which has changed from a proposed budget of 68 million to a proposed budget of just under 50 million. Significant reduction, but still significant investment. So I think those are both important things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So in talking about the Measure C funding, I just wanted to bring to the council and the public's attention that in 2018, the council set the priorities for use of Measure C for the first 5 years. They were, and I'm sorry, on 3, you'll see there is a typo. I was moving through this rather quickly because I was scheduled to do it next Wednesday, but that's going to be a very long meeting. So I got this together in a little more hurry than I would have liked. But the first priority was planning, permitting, and bonding for a new police station, repairing local streets, including street infrastructure, replacing fire station number 7, community projects to support city's parks and library, business district infrastructure projects, and maintenance of city buildings are the top 6 priorities for Measure C. And so with that direction, we have worked to create Measure C allocations that reflect council's policy. Next slide, please. So this is just a summary of the General Fund and Measure C uses by general area. So you can see that for library, for example, we've got $1.5 million, all Measure C. Parks and Recreation, it is a combination of General Fund, Measure C, and in this case, the CDBG is other, but Parks is also very adept at applying for and getting grants. Typically, they do that after they've gotten to a point of final design. So there are no grants secured that I'm aware of at this point in time, but certainly candidate projects for grants. You'll see no money in public safety. I will talk about that. We are not defunding public safety. We are pushing forward on that. City facilities are buildings, so that's consistent with the direction of the policy. Streets, a very significant effort for streets, and in large part due to the fact that, like the roof on your house, if you don't repair streets in a timely manner, everything underneath starts to fall apart and it gets much, much more expensive. So you'll see that the total general fund money is 400 and the total Measure C is 22 million. Next slide, please. And this is my next apology because the header for this one cut off. But the first column is fund. The second column is FY20 funding. So there was 73,000 for library ADA elevator in general fund money in 20. And in 21, we had proposed 1.5 in Measure C. That's an extremely high priority project for very obvious reasons. The library is a great asset for our community and used by all kinds of people with all kinds of abilities. So we really are excited to be able to keep that one going forward. We will need a little more money. I'm confident we'll figure out how to get that as we get to construction. Unfortunately, we are having to pause 2 other high priority projects, the library staff workspace renovation and the library plaza renovation. The library plaza expects to do a fair amount of fundraising, not necessarily the time to go out with that kind of initiative at this point. And then the library workspace really wanted to use our Measure C money to prioritize projects that that benefit the public and the city employees. And so this was a hard decision. We fully expect that we will be able to move forward with that one next year. It is fully designed, so it's ready to go. Next slide, please. And here we are with the benefit of headers. So Parks and Recreation, you will see a number of projects here. That's reflective of the fact that Parks has a large number of properties and a large number of facilities that they are charged with maintaining and improving. There is 350 of general fund money proposed for Ortega Park in 21. That will take that project to final design. And Ms. Zachary, who's available if you have questions, is hopeful that that will spur the opportunity for grant funding and grant investment in that project. It's one that we've been working with the community for over a year to develop a master plan. So keeping that to final design is a good investment of that last piece of money here to get plans and specs and then try and get either a phased approach or grant funding or both. You will see that the West Beach Splash Playground has been paused. The playground replacement program is an ongoing program where we keep our playground safe for children and enjoyable, and we try to invest in those each year. The Parks has been awarded $100,000 for CDBG, so they decreased their funding request a little bit there, making it up with CDBG, and they will be doing a playground replacement. Louise Lowry Davis is another high priority community serving building. It is used heavily by our seniors. We are proposing to increase the funding there to be able to complete that project. Ms. Zachary was awarded $254,000 in CDBG grant funding. So with the 935 of Measure C, we will be able to complete that project. That's one that's been waiting for a while. We put it on pause while we were trying to determine the preferred alternative for the police station. That is moving well forward, and we believe this is an appropriate time to restart that project. Street trees and medians. This is just like the rest of our infrastructure. Our street trees need to be maintained and our medians need to be maintained, both to keep them looking good, but also to prevent hazards for our public. Cabrillo Pavilion, there is no new funding. What did happen in 20, we made some last minute adjustments to pay off a loan that the Measure C had, that the general fund had given to Measure C. It was a smoothing effort to sort of spend that out over several years. Given the state of the general fund reserves with the COVID emergency, it was necessary to restore those. So we've cut the current fiscal year capital, Measure C capital, and we are repaying that general fund loan so that the reserves will have that money actually as money as opposed to a loan. The fleet reserves, which is basically a sinking fund for replacing vehicles, also loaned money to Cabrillo Pavilion. And that loan is 1.5. We had planned to start to pay that back at $535,000 a year, but we are now proposing to defer that another year so that we can give a little more space for that. Fleet is fine. They have plenty of money to make the purchases they'll need to make this year. Additionally, we will be looking very carefully at slowing down or managing the way that we manage our fleet. So that also lessens that demand. The Mackenzie Adult Building is slated for $95,000. This is one, it's a roof, and important to do before things underneath that roof start to get damaged, and it has been leaking for years. And then the Carrillo Gym and Park restrooms is lumped together, but they are actually two separate projects. And the Carrillo Gym is about almost $600,000 project that is very, very much needed. That building is built in 1925 and greatly in need of just general maintenance and repair, painting and fixing this falling siding so that we can get it in good shape and keep it around for the next 100 years. Next slide, please. Public safety, I wanted to show that although we are not adding new funding, we have two active projects there, the replacement of Fire Station 7 and the new police station, both of which have funding already allocated in the current fiscal year that will get us through next fiscal year. We were proposing another $2 million for the police station to try and build up that amount. So the amount we need to borrow in bonds will be less. But at this time, we are going to put that to more active use and active projects that will be completed in this next year. Next slide. City facilities, we have an ongoing ADA transition plan. We had hoped to update that plan as well as continuing to invest in our ADA facilities. We are temporarily decreasing the funding in that, although, as you saw previously, we are moving forward with one of our biggest ADA projects, which is the library elevator, as well as continuing to work on the elevator in City Hall. That's not taking any new funding this year, but it is currently in design. So we're continuing to pursue those important ADA projects, but with the advent of Measure C, have some different tools to allow us to do that. The City Hall plumbing and restrooms, you all use them frequently and they are much in need of repair. This is actually just for the design. We will need substantially more money for that, for construction. But this money will get us through final design. City buildings and envelopes and roofs, we have deferred this. This is to re-roof and manage the buildings at Garden Street and Laguna Street, which are largely temporary buildings. We are going to take a step back, do a facilities master plan, which you see at the bottom, and really just try and take a look at what the overall long-term needs are and what's the most efficient way to house our city facilities, including looking at how we use our corporate yard, because we do a lot of heavy equipment and materials and equipment storage. Facilities renewal is the money that's going to facilities through their fund. They get a direct allocation from budgets, and they're reducing that by 608. That's for parking lots and paint and replacing carpets and replacing windows and all of the things that you need to do to keep a building functioning. And the master plan there, I'm sorry, I see an error. It should be funded at 200,000, and we will be using staff time to make up the difference. Next slide, please. So streets and right-of-way, as I said, there's significant work going on in streets and right-of-way. And in fact, if you drive down State Street today, you'll see it's being repaved with the lack of people on it. It's great to take advantage of that. We took $6 million out of the paving project last month to repay that loan. So you're seeing an increase in FY21 to refund to be able to move forward with that paving project. It's a $6 million project that's been bid. The contractor has agreed to hold their bid. So we would like to move forward and award that bid as soon as we get to the new fiscal year. Streets Capital comes in, that's another funding source. It's made up of a number of different sources, such as utility user tax, Measure A sales tax, and various other little pots of money that come in. Drainage, we have reduced by 400,000. Our drainage system really needs a lot of work, but this allows us to continue to chip away at it. Sidewalks continue to be a major area of focus for us, although we have had to reduce that amount to accommodate the reductions we're looking for. And you can see the same with street lights and traffic signals. I did want to point out that we have increased, at Mr. Casey's request, the proposed funding for business corridors on the basis that we believe that we may need to have some extra money to either make them look better or figure out other creative ways to help businesses as we come out of this COVID emergency. The final thing I want to say about the streets and right-of-way is that we have $6 million of that $12 million that was originally proposed for funding is to go for our overlay projects. That's the street resurfacing done by contract. And just as we did this year, we will do the design and get those all ready for bid. But then if we don't have revenues meeting our expectations, we would be ready to just bid those the following year. So this allows us to keep going with this important infrastructure renewal and keep up as well as we can, but still be responsive and adaptive to any changes to revenues that might come in. Next slide, please. And so that was a very high level summary of our capital program. And this is a picture of our streets crews up on Gibraltar, repaving Gibraltar last fall.
Thanks, Ms. Bjork. Mr. Casey, you have something to add?
Yes, Madam Mayor and Council Member, I think Ms. Bjork gave a good overview, and so happy to get any council's questions or comments. One nuance I just want to highlight, because we talked about it at the Finance Committee, if the extraordinary person dealing with PowerPoints, who I won't name by name, if you can go back to slide 2 for me, please, I would appreciate that. At Finance Committee, we talked about there's a council policy about what to do with year-end reserves. And the policy has been that half of the year-end reserves go to, and that's the money that you come up at the end of the fiscal year. Once you balance all the books, we traditionally end up with savings because of good fiscal policy and planning throughout the year. And the policy from council has been that half goes to general fund capital and half goes to reserves to try to keep reserves funded at that full policy level. So it's been 50%, 50%. Over the years, council in individual years has waived that for one way or the other. So you always have the right to do that. And so the staff recommendation that we've come out here, and you see it on the top line, general fund, the original proposal was $800,000 in the general fund, and we're recommending now $400,000 to the general fund. And what we presented to the Finance Committee was that 25% would go to a capital program this year and 75% to reserves, just in recognition that we're hitting our reserves hard. And so needing that now kind of becoming the short-term priority for those excess monies. And at Finance Committee, we did throw out, and there was some question that you could go to 0% to capital and have all that money from the last fiscal year go to reserves, again, to recognize the stress we are putting on our reserves at this time. That's not what we're recommending. What we're showing is the 25%. But I just wanted to throw that out there, that that's a consideration. It's about $130,000 difference. And so realistically, that would come out of the Ortega Park project. If you looked at the next slide, I believe it is, if you could go forward one. Keep going. Go to another slide, please. Yeah, one more. Go one more. There you go. Thank you very much. If you'll notice, general funding wise, we're down to really two projects, the $350,000 for Ortega Park and $50,000 for ADA improvements across the city. We'd really like to maintain some semblance of that ADA program, just kind of as an annual commitment to that. And so if the policy direction from council was to have it all go to reserves, we'd have to reduce funding in the remaining general fund project, which is Ortega Park. Again, that's not our recommendation today, but I wanted to share that for council consideration since we did talk about it Finance Committee, and that would be the ramification of going to that policy approach. And I'm happy to answer more questions on that. But other than that, I'll get out of the way, and Ms. Bjork and I are here to answer any questions on all this capital presentation.
Ms. Sneddon, you're ready with the question on this segment. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yeah, just on this segment, so the revision to Measure C General Fund, and on slide 2, I think it is, it's actually really hard to see on our printout. Maybe if we can limit it to four reductions per sheet, it becomes hard to see the tiny numbers. But I think it's slide 2. Measure C general fund reduction goes from 26 million roughly to 22 million. Is that reduction projected from loss of revenue, or is that money that's being allocated somewhere else?
Mr. Casey, I'd like to take this.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Madam Mayor and Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, that is just loss of revenues. That's our revenue projection of sales tax hit, and that's the Measure C component of that.
So initially we had projected an increase over what we thought Measure C would produce by about 4 million, and now it's sort of adjusted back to what we initially projected. I don't know if that's being clear. Okay.
Yeah, we're living with Measure C revenue for the first couple of years, and it really attracts sales tax, but it's calculated slightly different by the state. And so we were actually getting more revenue in the Measure C pot than we originally thought we were going to as we started living with it for a couple of years, and how they calculate the nuance of what that special add-on tax was. But then, yes, the reduction now is just a clearly reflection of our estimate of the impact of sales tax from this crisis.
Well, excellent. I just really want to thank the voters for coming through on Measure C. I don't know where we would be without it, and that was a really big push, and I'm very grateful. So then I have another question. When you were saying the half to general fund and half to reserves, Mr. Casey, if you could, if half goes, is it to Measure C general fund or to, here's my question, I'm not sure how to phrase it. If it's Measure C money, and no, it's not Measure C money. Okay, you're nodding no. It's general fund excess to go half back to general fund and half into reserves.
Let me give you, Madam Mayor and Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, let me give you a little history on it and see if I can explain it. So we adopt a budget every year and you go through the year, and just because you can't spend every dime you budget because you have vacancies or a project doesn't move forward, and oftentimes revenues come in a little bit better than forecasted, you end the fiscal year with a surplus. And it's traditionally been in the $4 million range of a $130 million budget. And historically, that just flowed to reserves. That's how you kind of funded your reserves year in and year out, as you kind of swept the difference up at the end of the fiscal year and you put it into reserves, and that's how you funded your reserves. In about 2012, the City Council was very focused on capital planning and wanted to put an emphasis on capital. And so they adopted a policy to say, hey, we're doing okay on reserves and we really want to emphasize capital. Let's do half and half. And so that was a council resolution that was adopted. Like I said, that got tweaked a number of years by council just based upon the conditions of the year. And so this year, staff's recommendation is reserves is kind of a super big priority as we kind of manage our way through this. And so we're saying, let's dial that back just a little bit. Requires council to approve that. You could go back to 50-50, or like I said, you could go to 0 to capital and have it all go to reserves. Our recommendation is to go to that 25% level.
I think that's an excellent idea, especially because even with all that's happening, there is a lot budgeted for capital improvements here, and that's coming through Measure C and coming in different ways. And so it does seem like our reserves is going to be harder hit than our capital. It's sort of astonishing we can still do all these capital improvements with so much going on. And then one more question, just maybe this is for Ms. Bjork, with how the Cabrillo Pavilion, I'm just trying to figure out with this. So after, I think it's, is it slide 7? I think it's slide 7. And again, I can't read it on the this one. Yeah, so does this mean that after the proposed funding for fiscal year 21, is it paid off and done?
Mayor Murillo, Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon, not quite. We still have the loan to Fleet Reserves that will need to be repaid. Those will be repaid from Measure C revenues, but we are proposing to repay them in future years since we did such a big repayment this fiscal year from Measure C already.
So then there'd be nothing in fiscal year 21, but later, after fiscal year 21, we'd pick it back up again.
That's
correct.
Is that,
and what is that total?
Well, it was a $1.5 million loan from Fleet Reserves. That money generally earns interest. So the $535,000 you see there was the loan plus interest. It was going to be paid back over 3 years starting this year. We will have a little more interest because we're not going to be paying it back until next year. The interest is important because we calculate that into how much money we're going to need to replace vehicles and how much money we need to be saving for vehicles. So we, if we don't do that, we won't have a fully funded fleet reserve. That is always something that we could deal with at a later time, although it's been a very, very strong financial policy for this council to have that pre-funded essentially.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Jordan?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Hi, Ms. Bjork. Could you explain to me again the slide on the library on the Plaza project? Was that going to be fully funded this year and start construction with Measure C funds?
Mayor Murillo, Councilmember Jordan, no, it was going to be through final design, and that money was to be pre-funding work to do fundraising to get that project fully funded. I believe the fully funded project is around 3 or 4 million. I can look that up if you like.
Okay, so it's not like not like we're having to take that one off the table and leave it because of this. There was still work to do there, right?
That's correct. And we're actually leaving it in a very good place, which is through final design. We will continue to look for opportunities to find grant funding potentially for that if it was eligible, or other funding sources, as well as working with the library to do fundraising. This just defers that activity on the fundraising and the pre-funding of the plaza for a year.
So for that and anything else on this list, what's the process of actually sales tax performs better than projected? If we bounce back better and we get that extra, whatever it is, to Measure C, what is the process that you go through to come back and start horse trading for which project should rise to the top for those extra funds?
Well, ultimately, that would be done in collaboration with all of the departments, but then recommended to Finance Committee and Council. Certainly, those projects that have been completely designed and are ready to go are the highest priority because they're the easiest to roll out. Shovel ready, as they say.
Yep. Okay. Thank you so much.
Other questions for Ms. Bjork? Ms. Gorman, are there folks waiting to speak about this?
Madam Mayor and Council, no, there are no public speakers on this item.
Okay, we'll close public comment. We'll open and close it. And Mr. Casey, as we close this session, oh, go ahead, Ms. Sneddon, questions or comments? Go ahead.
Comments, Madam Mayor, thank you. I think just in general comments here, I think putting off the design of the splash pad is sort of, some issues came up with that anyway, and putting that off I think is fine if we're doing in the comments portion. And then Mr. Casey, you said maintaining most of the ADA or some, and I just want to make a push for maintaining all the ADA upgrades. I think before we go designing new parks and new places, it seems a priority to have the ADA up to par and
yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Mayor and Council Mayor Pro Tem Sneddon. Ms. Bjork and I completely agree. We have been putting in money in the general fund to ADA improvements to all of our city facilities so that each year we're able to make improvements. We are scaling that back down to $50,000. However, one of the major projects we are funding in Measure C, over $1 million, is the ADA compliant elevator in the library, which has been a long-standing goal. So we think that's a real strong commitment to a really heavily used essential public facility.
And our City Hall elevators.
We are in the design portion of that,
yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. Keeping the lights on and having it, yeah.
And also the bathroom project that we're doing will also address ADA for those bathrooms that are not compliant currently. So yeah, so a lot of work going on there. And then I didn't want to fail to mention that we're doing a lot of access ramps as we're doing paving around the city. I know we got over 100 new ones added in last year. We're ticking down. I think we're at about 800 remaining. So certainly making good progress on that. That's, I think, somewhere in the range of about half the access ramps that are needed. But so we really are committed to making our community accessible to everybody and continuing that work.
And I know this to be true of all of the departments. So I just wanted to highlight that moving forward, that's still a priority. And thank you.
Any other comments for the council? I had wanted to set a sense of hope actually for this particular discussion, or if we're closing. So Mr. Casey, what we heard today from the governor was positive, and it seemed like there would be more ability for the county economy to open up. And so the decisions that we're making today are fluid. Whatever budget we adopt in June, and I know we're just kind of at the beginning of the process, it'll be, what is that word, where we're adopting a budget, but we'll be able to adapt as our economy opens. And I guess I want the council members to know that we're moving money around, and it looks like we're being very careful spending, and we're stopping spending on some things. But if there's breathing room, if we get more revenues, then we'll adapt. Is that right?
Thank you, Madam Mayor and council members. I don't have a whole lot of details. I'm actually going on a phone call in a few minutes to learn more about the governor's announcement at noon. I think he's changing the standards from what I read briefly, but those metrics that the counties need to be in from a public health standpoint before they can proceed further into stage 2. And I think they're more realistically achieved targets that I think there's hope that Santa Barbara and a lot of other counties in the state will be able to meet, which means we go into phase 2. So yes, there's going to be some excitement that we're slowly kind of coming out, but I want to caution, I think we're a long ways away from having a robust economy that gives us a lot of positive variance on the budget. That's still not my mindset. I think we still need to be monitoring carefully and make adjustments as necessary one way or the other. But I agree, and I've said repeatedly, we're going to keep a close eye on this budget and make adjustments throughout the fiscal year, not just let it go untethered for the whole year.
Thanks, Mr. Casey. This will conclude our budget hearing today, unless someone else pops up from my colleagues. Tomorrow, we're looking at the Parks and Recreation budget, and that includes creeks and the Golf Fund. So that's tomorrow at 2. It'll take place, that'll be the bulk of our city council meeting tomorrow, our regular city council meeting on Tuesdays. And then on Wednesday, May 20th, the departments that we'll be reviewing in terms of their budget are fire, police, finance, and general government. And the city attorney's department has been moved to June 2nd. Do I have that correct? Okay. So if you're looking at our website at the different at our budget hearing schedule, there's a brand new one that's been updated. And Mr. Kalan, maybe you just wanted to confirm that your department will come up to the city council on June 2nd?
Yes, Madam Mayor, Mr. Casey and I thought it made more sense to have it in conjunction with the community development budget.
Thank you, sir. So with thanks to the staff and to the public who participated today, we'll close this meeting of the Santa Barbara City Council. Meeting adjourned.